Hello, my name's Professor Matthew Hindson and I'm from the Sydney Conservatorium for Music, part of the University of Sydney. In this video, I'm going to show you how and why you should develop ideas when writing your own compositions, including some of the standard and common ways that composers do this. When writing music, much of the skill of the composer is based around balancing new material with existing material. You might think the most skill is in bringing in lots of new ideas, but actually, that's not correct. This is especially important if you're writing a short piece. If your piece is up to, say, 4 minutes in length, and particularly if it's about 2, by the way, you really should be using just 1 or 2 starting musical ideas. Anything more than this is overkill and will work against you in writing a good piece of music. Most commonly, the term motif will be used to describe short musical ideas. And here's an example of a really common motif. You're going to recognise this when I play it to you. So this is an example of a motif, a short musical idea. Now, if you're Beethoven and you've created this motif, what do you do next? Well, there are only really 3 things you can do. Let's imagine that the Beethoven motif is represented by this playing card. So this idea is the King of Clubs card. What can I do next? Well, I can repeat it. Each time exactly the same. That's fine. That's called repetition. Repetition is extremely important in music, and when listening to a piece of music, we need to have things repeated. We as humans tend to notice patterns, and repetition is really important for that. So don't think that you have to do new things all the time. Repetition is a good thing, and please don't forget this when you're writing music. So back to the single motif. What else could I do? I could vary it. You can see that all these cards are still the King of Clubs, but they're also varied. They're all related to the first card, but they're all different, some more so than others. This is called development or variation. For most composers and listeners, this is the most interesting part of music. The final option I have after I state my first motif is to do something completely different. You can immediately see from these images they have nothing to do with the King of Clubs. In music, shifting between existing material and completely new ideas can be a high-risk venture. It may not always pay off. When you're contemplating the 3 images here, you may be thinking, what does that sandwich have to do with the octopus? And I'll say to you that if people are thinking things like this when listening to your music, it's not a good thing. So out of interest, what did Beethoven do after he stated his very first motif, his first musical idea? Have a listen. So Beethoven repeated it but changed it. He straight away developed the motif. But let's focus on developing ideas now. Why is developing your ideas a good thing? Firstly, it's much easier to change something that already exists as opposed to creating new material. This is the case in real life. Think about how new trends are created. Someone creates something new, it's a success, and then everyone else jumps on the bandwagon and creates variations on it. Why? Because it's easier. The same thing goes with composing a piece. When you're writing a piece, you often get stuck in the middle and you don't know what to do. If that's ever happened to you, I'll give the solution. The answer to this is to go back and look at what you've already done in that piece, choose an existing idea from it, and then change it or develop it in some way. That's the way out. The second reason why composers develop material is because it creates a larger sense of unity. Unity in a composition contributes to a feeling of satisfaction in the end result. If a composition is based on a small number of ideas, which are then developed, there's a much better chance in creating a sense of unity in the end. Think of it like a film. The progress in a film, initially it establishes certain characters and they are developed by their actions, by what they do and what they say. If all of a sudden in the middle of a film you get a brand new character introduced, it's potentially strange and possibly very unsatisfying. It's the same with a piece of music. A completely new idea in the middle may not be such a great idea. Now we're going to have a look at some standard development techniques that composers use, and we're going to use the Beethoven motif as a starting point. That's the motif we've already heard. And again, let's use an image to represent the motif because it makes it so easy to change and to see those changes, which you then can translate into music. So the easiest thing I could do with this image is just repeat it. I've just copied and pasted it. Now think about how you might do this in music. And what about if you repeated something not immediately, but later on in a piece, with other material between it? That could work very nicely, and it's a really good way to use repetition. Repetitions can change, that is, be developed in some ways that we've been talking about. In this image, I've moved the repeated Wonder Woman down the page slightly. She's still the same image, but her position has altered. Can you think of a similar process we use in music? Transposition is the act of keeping the same pitch shape of the music, but starting on a different note. In the same way that on the previous slide, Wonder Woman was the same, but placed in a different position. Hear how Beethoven did that? It's the same motif, the same musical material, but it starts on a second note. In this example, I've varied the image of Wonder Woman by changing her vertically. I've made her shorter and taller. Now, this didn't take much brain power, particularly with computers doing all the work for me. How could this process be used when developing musical ideas? Here's how Beethoven does it. The first example here is the original motif. There are 3 repeated notes and then a lower note. In the second example, the lower note is not as far down as it was as compared to the first note in the original. The distance has been compressed. Whereas in the third example, the lower note is further down than it was correspondingly in the original motif. The distance has been expanded. In this image, I've extended the original pattern in 2 ways. First, I've stretched Wonder Woman out horizontally here. Now, thinking about how to do this in music, a simple way would be to use longer note values. For example, here I've doubled each of the first note values. They're longer than in the original. Now, this process of elongating notes in this way, making notes longer, is called augmentation. And by the way, the diminution here refers to making the note values shorter. Here's another way that I've extended the image. In this example, I've added material to the end of the original motif. It's a simple way of using the original idea while adding to it. And here I'm showing you an example of how Beethoven added 2 bars of material to the end of the motif. Listen to the contrast between the original motif and its extended, expanded forms. Another easy way to vary an image is to flip it. For example, here I've flipped the image vertically. I have inverted it. In music, we can do the same thing. If the original shape of the idea goes down, then we invert it, we flip it by making it go up, and vice versa. Beethoven did this. And here I've flipped the image horizontally. In other words, it's back to front as compared to the original. Think about how you could do this in music. One really important technique that has come into its own, especially in the 20th and now the 21st century, is this idea of fragmenting. Here you can see I've fragmented an image. I've taken it and I've divided it into 3 parts, which is called fragmentation. And then I've reordered it, I've repeated it, I've developed them, I've put them up and put them down. And each fragment you use can be then further developed. The final development technique I want to show you here is altering the context of the original material. For example, here we have the image of Wonder Woman in the lower right-hand side of the picture. She's placed on a solid white background. But if we place her within a different sort of scenario, for example, cartoon-drawn X-Men, the context in which you perceive her is changed. Alternatively, our expectations of this image and what it means or represents is significantly different if, for example, she's a contestant on The Voice. Now, instead of a superhero, perhaps she's a woman in a costume in a talent show. So context is really important. It can change our entire perception of what may first seem obvious. How does this work in music? I've listed some things here that you could think about to consider in terms of how you could change the context. For example, you could change the chords that go underneath a melody or a motif, or change the chord progression. This will make it seem quite different. For example, even if you had a series of major chords and then you change them to all minor chords, it may make a difference. You can change the rhythm of what goes underneath, or in fact, even of the motif itself. So for example, I could put a waltz type of tempo behind the Beethoven motif, and then it becomes some sort of dance tune rather than something from a symphony. In terms of the register and the orchestration, this has to do with where you put the instruments and what you get them to do with the different players. So for example, you could have the motif in a very high register. For example, if you think about the very top of the piano has a very different sound to the very bottom of the piano. It could play exactly the same material, but in those two contexts, it's going to sound very different. And indeed, the orchestration, that is, who is playing the musical idea, is really important. That's a really typical and common way of changing the context. You can give the motif to different players to play. It's a very simple thing to do, but it can change how you perceive it. And there's dynamics, and there's all those other musical elements that you'll know about, which really do make a difference. There's a further multitude of possibilities available to you when you're developing your ideas, and there's too many to go through here. And really, they're only limited by your own imagination when it comes down to it. Anything is possible. Nothing is right or wrong, but it's really good to be creative and try new things. In conclusion, how could this be useful to you in your own musical creation? As I previously mentioned, developing motivic and other musical ideas will enable you to potentially create work that is musically satisfying, which tends towards unity. And this is true no matter what style or genre you're writing in, whether it's classical, jazz, contemporary, or anything else. The end result will be perceived to be stronger if it demonstrates development of a smaller rather than a larger set of ideas. You'll also find it easier to write. Don't forget, it's easier to develop a musical idea you already have in your composition rather than come up with a new one from scratch.